True Horror Stories. The first time I saw death standing in a room, I was only 11 years old, and it was watching my sister sleep. This happened during what was supposed to be a peaceful family getaway in the spring of 2011 in a remote cabin tucked deep into the Virginia wilderness. What my family experienced over those 48 hours would remain unspoken for years, not because we didn't believe it, but because each of us thought we were losing our minds. The cabin was designated C43, a weathered structure positioned so close to the forest trail that pine branches scraped against the roof when the wind blew. Jellystone Park in Luray, Virginia, advertised it as the perfect escape, rustic charm surrounded by untouched nature, miles from the nearest town. My parents, desperate for a break from their demanding careers, had booked it for a long weekend without knowing the property's history. None of us knew what waited in those woods. My younger sister, only 8 at the time, and I were assigned the smaller bedroom at the back of the cabin. A cramped space barely large enough for the single bed we would share. The room had one window that faced directly into the forest, and my mother insisted on keeping it cracked open despite the chill in the air. She said the fresh mountain air would help us sleep better. She had no idea how wrong she was. That first evening felt normal enough. We explored the trail behind the cabin as twilight painted the sky purple and orange, collected smooth stones from a nearby creek, and roasted marshmallows over a portable fire pit my father had brought. The forest around us was alive with sound, cicadas buzzing in waves, owls calling from invisible perches, branches creaking as unseen animals moved through the underbrush. But as darkness fell completely, those familiar sounds took on a sinister quality. The owls no longer sounded peaceful. They sounded like warnings. The creaking branches felt like footsteps circling the cabin. Even the wind through the trees seemed to carry whispers we couldn't quite make out. My sister and I climbed into bed around 9:30, exhausted from hiking and fresh air. I remember lying there, listening to my parents moving around in the main room, their voices muffled through the thin walls, the clink of dishes being washed in the small sink. Those ordinary sounds were comforting, proof that we weren't alone in this isolated place. Eventually, their voices stopped and the cabin fell silent, except for the eternal rustle of leaves outside our window. Sleep came quickly, but it wouldn't last. I don't remember dreaming before I woke up. My eyes simply opened in the darkness, and immediately my body understood that something was terribly wrong. The feeling was primal, the same instinct that tells you when you're being hunted, when a predator has you in its sights. My heart was already racing before my brain could process why. The moonlight streaming through our window had turned the room silver and black, creating shadows that seemed to pulse and breathe. And in those shadows, directly beside where my sister and I lay sleeping, stood a figure. He was massive, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the window behind him. His arms were folded across his chest in a posture of absolute authority, and his face was contorted into an expression of such raw hatred that even in my terrified state I felt ashamed, like I had committed some unforgivable transgression simply by existing in this space. For several heartbeats, my child's mind tried desperately to rationalize what I was seeing. This must be my father, I thought. He must have come to check on us, and I've done something to anger him. But my father was shorter, slimmer, and he had never looked at me with such venomous contempt. And then I noticed the impossible detail that shattered any remaining hope of a logical explanation. Through the figure's torso, clear as day in the moonlight, I could see my bright red winter coat hanging on its hook against the far wall. The man, or whatever he was, possessed no substance. He was constructed from shadow and malice, translucent enough that solid objects were visible through his body, but opaque enough that I could make out every detail of his furious expression. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything except lie there, paralyzed with terror, but my body had become a prison, my muscles locked, my voice trapped somewhere deep in my chest. That's when I heard it, barely more than a breath, my sister whispering my name. The sound was so fragile, so filled with fear, that it told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't hallucinating. I wasn't dreaming. We were both seeing the same nightmare. I didn't respond to her whisper. I couldn't. Instead, I did the only thing my panicked mind could conceive. I rolled away from the figure, yanked the thin blanket over my head, and squeezed my eyes shut so tightly that bright spots exploded across my vision. Underneath that blanket, I prayed to every deity I'd ever heard of, bargaining away birthday presents and future Christmas gifts if only this thing would disappear. The presence didn't leave. I could feel it hovering over us, its attention heavy and suffocating, like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, my heart hammering so hard I was certain it would wake my parents, my breath coming in short gasps that I tried desperately to quiet. At some point, exhaustion must have overwhelmed fear because consciousness slipped away and pulled me under. When awareness returned, the room was still dark, but something had changed. My sister was shaking my shoulder urgently, her small hands trembling as she tried to wake me without making noise. I opened my eyes to see her sitting up in bed, her pink children's flashlight clutched in both hands, its beam dancing across the wall as her hands shook. She was pointing the light towards the doorway that connected our bedroom to the main living area of the cabin. Following the beam of her flashlight, I saw him again. The figure was no longer standing guard over our bed. Instead, he had moved to the dining table in the next room, seated in one of the wooden chairs with his hands clasped together on the table surface. His posture suggested deep contemplation, like he was working through some profound problem or waiting patiently for something he knew would eventually arrive. My sister, braver than I could ever be, aimed her flashlight directly at him. The beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating his translucent form. For a split second, I saw him clearly, every detail of his face, the deep lines around his mouth, the hollow darkness where his eyes should have been, the way his hair was slicked back from his forehead. And then, as if the light itself was poison to his existence, he simply ceased to be. One moment he was there, solid enough to cast shadows, real enough to terrify, and the next moment there was only an empty chair and the sound of my sister's ragged breathing beside me. We didn't sleep again that night. We lay side by side, her flashlight clutched between us, watching the doorway and waiting for dawn. Morning arrived with cruel slowness, gray light seeping through the windows and revealing the cabin exactly as it had been. Worn furniture, faded curtains, absolutely nothing to suggest the horror we'd experienced just hours before. When we finally emerged from our room, faces pale and eyes ringed with dark circles, we found our mother already awake. She was sitting at the very table where we'd seen the figure, a mug of coffee growing cold in her hands, and she looked as exhausted as we felt. Her first words were strange. She asked if either of us had been walking around during the night, if we'd gone outside or moved through the cabin. We both said no, confused by the question. She studied our faces for a long moment, clearly debating whether to share something, but ultimately she just nodded and told us to get dressed for breakfast. The entire day felt wrong. The sunlight seemed dimmer than it should have been. The forest sounds were too quiet, and my parents moved through their routines with a distracted tension that made my stomach hurt. We didn't hike. We didn't explore. We barely left the cabin. My father suggested card games and board games, his voice artificially cheerful, while my mother kept standing at the windows, staring out into the trees, with an expression I couldn't read. That night, my parents made an announcement. We were leaving first thing in the morning, cutting our trip short by 2 days. They claimed a storm was coming, that the weather forecast had changed, but there wasn't a single cloud in the sky. We packed in silence the next morning, threw our bags into the car, and drove away from Cabin C43 without looking back. The 3-hour drive home passed without conversation, each of us lost in our own thoughts, processing something we couldn't name. Years passed before we spoke about it. 5 years, maybe 6, the kind of time it takes for childhood trauma to transform into something you can examine without falling apart. I was home from college for Thanksgiving when my sister casually mentioned having recurring nightmares about our old family vacations. The comment hung in the air for a moment before my mother's fork clattered against her plate. And then, like a dam breaking, we all started talking at once. The figure with the angry face, my sister said. The man who could see through, I added. The light that came through the window, my mother whispered. We laid out every detail, comparing memories we'd kept locked away for years, and discovered that our experiences fit together like pieces of a puzzle we hadn't realized we were solving. My mother's story was the most disturbing. She had woken around 3 in the morning to see a sphere of brilliant white light hovering just outside the cabin window. She described it as roughly the size of a basketball, pulsing gently, radiating an illumination that seemed to come from within rather than reflecting external sources. As she watched, frozen in her bed, the orb had drifted forward and passed through the glass as if the window were made of smoke. It floated across the cabin in complete silence, moving with clear purpose towards the front door. The moment it passed through the door and disappeared outside, a voice had erupted from the walls themselves, deep and masculine and filled with rage. 3 words, shouted with such force that my mother was certain they would wake the entire cabin. "You don't belong here." But when she checked our rooms, we were all still sleeping, or at least appeared to be. She had spent the rest of that night sitting at the dining table with every light in the cabin turned on, waiting for sunrise. The realization that we had all experienced something, that this wasn't individual delusion or childhood imagination, was both validating and terrifying. Last month, driven by morbid curiosity, I searched for Jellystone Park online and found their website easily. Skyline Cabin C43 is still available for rent, the photos showing the exact same structure. The same proximity to the nature trail, the same windows that look out into endless forest. The listing describes it as rustic and peaceful, perfect for families seeking a quiet retreat. There are no warnings, no disclaimers, nothing to suggest that something angry and ancient might be waiting inside. I've searched for other reports, scoured forums and review sites, looking for anyone else who might have experienced something similar in that cabin or on that property. So far, I've found nothing, but absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. If you've ever stayed at Jellystone Park in Luray, Virginia, especially in Cabin C43 near the nature trail, and experienced anything you couldn't explain, anything that made you leave early or sleep with the lights on, I need to know. Because sometimes, usually in that space between waking and sleep, I still see him, the translucent figure with the hatred carved into his face, standing beside whatever bed I'm sleeping in. And I wonder if he's still there in that cabin. Arms crossed, expression furious, waiting for the next family who doesn't belong.